Hi everybody, welcome to Exam Revision. Today we're going to be looking at some exam tips and predictions for the Leaving Cert Higher Level Maths exam, which is going to be examined in June 2024. And before we get started, just to mention that Exam Revision is running May revision courses, which take place online, and they're going to be running over a week or two in May. But the Leaving Cert Higher Level Maths revision course specifically is taking place on Tuesday, the 21st of May, and that's happening from 5 until 8 pm. So, anyone who's interested, please go to examrevision.ie and follow the link to the live courses. And these courses can also be watched back on demand. So even if you're not available to attend on Tuesday the 21st, you can go on and purchase the course and you can watch it back whenever it suits you. Okay, so the first thing just to mention, I'm sure you're all very aware of this at this stage, particularly after your mock exams, but just a reminder that on the 2024 exam, you guys are going to have 6 questions in section A and you are expected to answer 5 of them, so they're all going to be worth 30 marks each. And then in section B, which is your context and applications questions, there's going to be 4 of them which are worth 50 marks and you are expected to do 3 of them. So again, it's worth the noting that section A is 150 marks and section B is 150 marks. So it's really important that we do try and ensure that we're not just only spending our time on our section A's, because we know, I suppose, they're generally a little bit more accessible when you look at them first of all anyway. Normally section B's are actually fine once you get into it, but sometimes they can look a bit kind of overwhelming because there's a lot going on. But just a reminder how important both sections are, and they're both equal marks on the exam, so just keep that in mind as you're going through the paper. So a few just really quick tips to think about going into the exam. So just make sure you're reading your questions carefully and really, I suppose, concentrate on what you're being asked to do. Whether that's solving a question where you know you're going to have to get x equals to something at the end, whether it's simplifying, factorizing, evaluating, just make sure you're looking through those words as you're doing your study over the next couple of weeks coming up to your exam. Obviously remember the importance of attempt marks. Make sure you're showing all of your work. Anything that you're typing into your calculator, make sure you're writing it down on your page as well. Don't assume later questions have most marks, so just obviously attempt everything to the best of your ability, but just because you can't answer the last part of a question, don't panic. That could only be worth 5 marks, so just don't lose sight of the bigger question when you are completing the exam. We know we've got 300 marks per paper and you've got 2.5 hours per paper. So my general advice would be for section A to spend about 15 minutes on each question. And obviously you've got 5 of those to do. And then for section B, I'd be saying 20 to 22 minutes per question. And again, that just gives you a little bit of wiggle room to have a few minutes at the start of the exam to read through. I will be recommending taking maybe 5 minutes at the start just to read through everything, because you obviously have a choice on the exam, so you want to make sure that you are maximizing your marks by completing the questions that you're most comfortable with. And again, hopefully with those time frames, you should have a few minutes spare if you need to go back to questions, or if you want, you could potentially try and maybe complete one more question in section A or B. But again, I think that will be very much reliant on how you've been getting on over the course of the exam and your other questions. I wouldn't be advising you to rush through just so you can answer the whole paper. I think that would actually be a negative thing to do for your results. So I'd be trying to do the questions that you've completed to the best of your ability, and if you feel, you know what, that question didn't go as well as I thought, then you might have an extra 10-15 minutes at the end where you could go and attempt another section A question if that was something that you wanted to do. Definitely make sure you're tracking your time spent per question, move on and mark to return to later. So do try and take note of the start time, or even jot it down on your page for each question, because it just helps you to kind of stay on track, particularly when you're conscious that you don't want to spend too much time on your section A's or too much time on your section B's. You want to make sure you've got an equal amount of time on both of them. Again, I've mentioned this already. If you use a calculator, make sure you're showing some of those workings on your page. Don't forget to reference your formula booklet. Obviously, you've so many formulae in there, so make sure you're comfortable with that in advance of the exam. Draw sketches to help visualize your questions. Watch out for your minus signs. It's really important, particularly again if you're putting them into brackets. Make sure you're using brackets on your calculator. For example, when you're squaring a negative number, you need to make sure it's bracket minus 2 bracket squared. If you just put in minus 2 squared without a bracket, your calculator will tell you the answer is minus 4. So just again, brackets and minuses are all very important. And do a common sense check with your answers. And this one is really important. Ensure you have implemented the correct degree of accuracy and included units. So my top tip would be for every single question that you complete, before you go to move on, double check and see, do I need to round it to a particular decimal place? Do I need to write it in terms of pi or whatever it might be? And is there a unit that I need to add into my solution as well? So that should be a check that you do with all of your questions as you're working through your exams. Again, I'm sure this is something that you're all very familiar with, but just make sure you have an idea in your head going into each paper of the main topics that you're going to be expecting to see. As you know, any topic can come up on any paper, but it's just a general guide of what we have been used to seeing over the last number of years as the main topics that come up on paper 1 and paper 2. So do spend a bit of time looking through your exam papers and make sure you're familiar with the questions that you're going to see more often than not on each paper. So this is the breakdown that I like to do every year for my students, showing the main topics. Again, this is not an in-depth list, but the main areas that have featured in each of our exam questions over the last number of years. I think it's a really nice way when you're revising to kind of have an overview in your mind of where you're going to expect to see each of your questions. So this could be something that you'll refer back to as you're doing your revision. But again, it's just to, I suppose, help you to kind of an oversight to see, okay, interesting, last year, for example, sequence and series didn't come up as a section A question, so potentially that could be something for you guys for 2024. I'd be kind of thinking we're probably going to see sequence and series come up as a section A question, and it could still absolutely come up as a section B as well. The general pattern over the years has been for it to come up as a section A and a section B. So you might see it as a full section A question and then maybe part of a section B question this year. Obviously just a guess at that. Obviously algebra we can see comes up every single year, and functions, complex numbers, you're pretty much guaranteed to have that as a question in section A. Your integration, your differentiation, again, it comes up as both a section A and a section B. Interestingly, financial maths has been very much, is it coming up, is it not coming up, for the last number of years. It did come up in 2023 for the first time in a few years. So some people might be predicting it's not going to come up this year, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it maybe came up as a section A like it came up in 2020. But again, who knows? Again, this video is more of just pointing you in the right direction rather than loads of groundbreaking predictions, because as you all know, Leaving Cert higher level maths, like everything comes up in some shape or form. It's obviously just getting down into the more minuscule details of different subtopics, but the main chapters feature pretty much every year. And that's why financial maths was a bit unusual that it hasn't, but we don't know what the trend will be for 2024. So again, if I was trying to predict what it would be, I'd be saying maybe a section A question, or maybe it just won't come up at all. And again, looking at paper 2, you can see an overview of the topics that we've seen over the last number of years. Again, there's nothing groundbreaking here, but it's just to give you that overview again. Again, some kind of key things to take away from it is we know probability comes up every year, pretty much as a section A, as well as statistics. You're kind of guaranteed, I'd say, 2 questions in section A on probability and statistics, and then at least 1 full question in section B, if not 2. Particularly, obviously, with the COVID years, we've had an extra question in section B, the way it's worked out with the marks. of the questions and the choice. So, you know, you could have potentially two probability and statistics questions going by the last couple of years, or at least mixed in with other topics. Then again, trigonometry, we can see you're pretty much guaranteed trig as a section A, and then definitely as at least one, if not two, section Bs. The line and the circle, always a guaranteed section A question for each of them. And then geometry tends to come up as one section A question, and it could be, you know, peppered in within section B's. I just haven't gone into the minute detail in this breakdown document. So I suppose even looking at your constructions, your proofs and things like that, we didn't have a construction or a proof last year, so potentially one of those could come up for you guys this year. Construction came up in 2022, and obviously it was a proof then in 2021, so the law of averages there, you could be thinking you might have a theorem coming up or a proof. Could be a construction, who knows, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about that now when I go into some more detail on each of the chapters. Okay, so now we're going to look at each of the kind of subcategories in a little bit more detail. And look, as I said already, there's nothing groundbreaking what I'm going to be going through here, but basically what I've done is I've gone back through the last number of years' exam papers, and I've kind of broken it down into more subcategories in each of these chapters. And what I've tried to do is pick out some of the topics that seem to come up every year, and I'm giving you those here. And I've also maybe made just a few little guesses. Again, these are all just educated guesses of some topics that maybe haven't come up in a few years that could feature for you guys for this year. So one that comes up in most years is the factor theorem, so make sure you've gone back over that. Something that I thought could feature for you guys this year is like inequalities in general. I would look over, and maybe even focusing in particular at rational inequalities. We haven't had an inequality question for the last 2 years, and a quadratic inequality came up in 2021. So look, again, it's just a little bit of a guess, but I don't think a rational inequality has come up since 2018 as far as I'm aware. So it's just something that make sure you've had a look over, and you know the trick about multiplying both sides by the denominator squared. Logs and indices feature most years, so just make sure you've gone back over that. Yeah, they featured nearly every year in some capacity on the paper. Algebraic fractions, while they absolutely feature within their own little questions on the exam, I don't think we've seen it as a standalone question for a number of years. So again, that could be something that might come up as a part A or B of an algebra section A question. Binomial expansion hasn't been examined, so that could be something to keep an eye on. In relation to functions, last year we had composite functions come up, and we had some bits related to injective and surjective functions. So again, one that I just had on my list even from last year was inverse functions. It could be like, again, a small bit of a question. Completing the square, I don't think that's been examined in a number of years, so definitely could be something. I don't think it's come up since maybe 2021, so it hasn't been on the exam the last 2 years, so that could be something just to throw your eyes back over. And then simultaneous equations, they came up in 2022, so that was three unknowns, and they would have come up again a few years previous to that. So again, might come up for you guys, but I definitely think it'll be worth looking at since it wasn't on the exam last year. So as I've mentioned already, it was interesting. Sequence and series only really featured as a section B question last year, and it was kind of an unusual enough question. But so based on previous years, prior to 2023, it generally was coming up as a section A and a section B. So I would say it's definitely going to be on it as a section A this year, and probably a section B. I've just noted there that again, this is prior to 2023, so up until last year, geometric had come up in some capacity every year. So just again, make sure you know the difference between your arithmetic, your quadratic, and your geometric sequences and series. Make sure you know which formulae to use, because it does seem to come up in some capacity on the exam most years. And quadratic hasn't come up as kind of like a standalone question since 2020, so potentially that could be something to keep an eye out for you guys for this year. Definitely go back over arithmetic as well. I'd be having a look over all of them, to be honest. But yeah, the fact quadratic hasn't come up since 2020, I'd be saying to make sure you also know how to form the TN formula for a quadratic, because remember that's not in your formula tables, so you'll have to go back over that one for forming the general equation for a quadratic pattern. Moving on to proof by induction, interestingly, it has not been examined for the last 2 years, so there's a very strong chance of that coming up for you guys this year. Then just to give you like what's come up in previous years, so the divisibility proof by induction came up in 2021, then a series came up in 2020, and an inequality came up in 2019. So again, take from that what you will. You could say, I suppose, obviously going by the fact that inequalities is the furthest away, that maybe that would be the one that will come up for you guys. But the fact that it hasn't come up for 2 years, like in my head, any of them could come up. And De Moivre's, the proof of De Moivre's, which is also proof by induction, hasn't come up since 2018. So like, I know I'm not really whittling it down for you much there. If I was to pick which ones I would say are most likely, maybe inequality and proof of De Moivre's theorem. But as I said, because it hasn't come up for 2 years, they could give you any of them. So I would definitely say it's worth having a look over, just to make sure you're comfortable with all of the different proof by induction methods. Moving on then to complex numbers. Look, I would say complex numbers, obviously, again, we know it comes up as a Section A question every year. It's worth just making sure you know all the main parts of complex numbers. So make sure you know De Moivre's theorem, you know how to solve equations using De Moivre's. So like talking about solving your complex equations. So just make sure you're comfortable with that, because De Moivre's theorem comes up pretty much every year, whether it's De Moivre's by itself or whether it's then going and solving your complex equations. Something that hasn't come up in a few years, it's specifically looking at the roots of complex coefficients when you're looking at the conjugate root theorem. So we know the conjugate root theorem works when your coefficients are real numbers, but it would be worth having a look back to the 2016 question when that you're looking for roots, but the coefficients are complex, so you can't use your conjugate root theorem. So I would say that would be worth maybe having a quick look at, just in case something like that comes up. But definitely make sure you just know your conjugate root theorem in general as well, because again, that does feature quite often. And then, as I've previously mentioned, proof of De Moivre's theorem hasn't come up in a number of years, so that could definitely be something to go back over for the 2024 exam. Then moving on to differentiation. Look, to be honest with you, with differentiation, because it features so heavily on the exam, they do tend to cover a lot of the main differentiation parts. But I suppose first principles didn't come up last year, so I'd be saying it's a stronger chance of it coming up for you guys. It had come up kind of every second year the last few years, so again, that could be one that might come up. Turning points, stationary points, max or min points come up every single year, so make sure you're comfortable finding those. Points of inflection hasn't come up, it didn't come up last year, and then it came up the 2 prior years to that. So again, make sure you've gone over max, min, and points of inflection. And then differentiating trig, logs, indices, exponential, like make sure make sure you can do all of that, because again, it tends to come up every year. And then your related rates of change, that also is quite a common enough question, and I don't think it came up last year, so again, one that could you guys could see coming up on your exam. So then moving on to integration. So look, I suppose last year the area between two curves came up, so they might get you to do the area under a curve maybe, or that mightn't come up at all, to be honest. Average value tends to come up most years, so again, look over integration for the last number of years and you'll see that there's always some link to an average value question. It's a really easy thing, but you need to obviously know to put the little fraction in front of the integral to complete the average value. Something that hasn't come up in a few years is looking at the trapezoidal rule and integration, like the link between those two. So they could get you to use the trapezoidal rule, then they could get you to do your integration for the area under a curve, and then compare and look at the error percentage error, which is, so to find percentage error, you're going to do the error over the correct amount. So that would be the integral value multiplied by 100. And then something that hasn't come up for the last 2 years is where they give you like the slope function, and they ask you to work backwards basically to find the actual equation of the function. So if you kind of think about it, they're giving you something that's been differentiated, and it's the slope, and then they're asking you to use integration to go backwards basically. So I'd say look back at the 2021 question for that, because as I said, it hasn't come up for the last 2 years. And then finally, financial maths. Look, there's nothing groundbreaking I can tell you about that, because it hasn't come up for it's only featured a few times over the last number of years. But I'd be kind of thinking if it's going to come up, it might come up as a section A question. But there's nothing to say that it could come up as a section B question again. So I would definitely make sure you've looked over the last few years, just so you're familiar with the general layout of financial maths questions. And yeah, uh, who knows? Basically, with financial maths, it's definitely one that it's hard to predict, because they could go back to just not putting it on the exam, or they might then start featuring it every year. So I would definitely be saying it's worth having in the back of your mind as a question that could come up as a section A in particular. Okay, and just before we move on to look at our paper 2 predictions, just a reminder that our website ExamRevision has the entire junior and leaving cert courses for a number of subjects broken down into bite-sized video tutorials and PowerPoints and quizzes and notes. So obviously it's getting close to the exam, and we do allow you guys to just take out a monthly subscription, and we are offering 10% off at the minute using 2024 tips as your code. So just in case anyone is interested in signing up for a little bit of an extra help coming up to the exam. Here are the subjects that we have available for the junior cycle. Here are our Leaving Cert subjects that we have available. So as I said, you can take out a monthly subscription to the website, and use that 10% off if it's helpful coming up to your Leaving Cert exams. And just a reminder again that we do have our May revision courses, as I mentioned at the start. They're 1 day intensive revision courses, and they're taking place between the 18th and the 26th of May. Have a look at our website for more details. It's all about just getting you ready for the exams, going through some of the key tips, and focusing on some of the most common topics and questions. Okay, moving on to paper 2 then. So we've already looked at the kind of overview of what you can expect with paper 2. I think paper 2 is a little bit more kind of, a little bit more laid out compared to paper 1, where you kind of know almost what to expect for your section A and your section B. So in relation to probability then, we know that can come up as a section A and a section B question. Some of the things that I'd be thinking could potentially be popular for you guys this year is Venn diagram. So a Venn diagram question with, probabilities in it that are linked with conditional, mutually exclusive, mutually inclusive, independent events. That hasn't come up for a few years. So I would definitely be saying there's a good chance that that could come up for you guys. I don't think it's come up since 2020. So I would definitely make sure you know all of these formulae, and you know how to then apply it into a Venn diagram question. Expected value tends to come up quite a lot as well. So it didn't come up last year, but it had come up the 2 previous years to that. So I would definitely make sure you've looked over expected value. And then Bernoulli trials seems to feature most years, so do make sure you look over Bernoulli trials as well. Moving on to statistics, again we see statistics feature quite a lot in section A and section B. I'd be saying there's a chance it might not come up as a section A this year, purely because it's come up as a section A the last 2 years, but we really don't know. But it's absolutely going to come up as a section B, and potentially 2 questions in section B. Again, nothing groundbreaking here, but this is more just make sure you absolutely know this really, really well, that you know how to do all your normal distribution, your standard normal distribution, your Z scores, all of that. every year without fail, you're going to see that somewhere on the paper. I'd also recommend maybe just looking back over the empirical rule in case you get a small empirical rule question. And then again, this is like absolutely no, no, no. And when I mean no, I mean KNOW. You need to make sure you've gone over your confidence intervals, your 95% confidence intervals, your hypothesis test, and you know both of them. You know how to do it for your mean and for your proportion, because either one could come up. And actually, another thing I should add in there as well is your p values, because that hasn't come up for a few years. I think it hasn't come up the last 2 years. So that all of those things within inferential statistics, I would be recommending that you absolutely know, because it does feature so heavily on the exam every year. Moving on then to trigonometry. Really with trig, we see all the main kind of things featuring most years. So make sure you know your Pythagoras' theorem, your SOHCAHTOA for your right angle triangles, and then for non-right angle triangles that you know your sine rule, your cosine rule, how to find the area of a triangle using your half AB sine C. Then another thing just to note is trigonometry comes up again as a section A and a section B, and you'll sometimes see it mixed in quite a lot with area and volume and functions. So just make sure you're looking over a few of those questions where they might be getting you to work with a shape, with a 3D shape or whatever, and then you're having to use some trig in with those questions as well. 3D trigonometry hasn't featured for a good few years, so that would be one to just kind of think about. But I suppose the main thing with the 3D trig question is just make it into a 2D question so that you can apply all of your normal trigonometry rules. Trig graphs are one that we see coming up quite a lot, so just make sure you've looked over those and you know how to transform them, so move them around the graph. Then with trigonometry, we know as well, you're probably going to have to prove one of your trig formulae, so make sure you've looked over those, and pay special attention to maybe sine and cosine, just on the off chance that something like that comes up to prove. Next up, looking at our line and circle, again we know we're pretty much guaranteed a line question in section A and a circle question in section A. So just a few kind of things to keep an eye out for that haven't come up for a couple of years is dividing a line in a ratio, or the angle between two lines. That didn't come up last year, so that could be something we might see this year. I would make sure you also know your simultaneous equations of how to work out the intersection between a line and a circle. Then problem solving with our circles with G, F and C comes up pretty much every year in some way, so just make sure you've looked over that. And again, on the off chance that something comes up in relation to like orthocenter or centroid, obviously we know that kind of from our constructions, but we can also link it in with our circle questions. So I would just recommend that you go over kind of the definitions of these, so that you know, if they tell you, okay, the centroid, that you know what that actually means in relation to a question. And then finally, we have our kind of geometry and length, area, and volume and stuff like that. So as I mentioned earlier on in the video, there hasn't been a construction or a theorem. There was no construction or a theorem last year. So the year before that, we had constructing the circumcenter of a triangle, and then the year before that, we had theorem 13. So, if I was trying to bet on which one would come up, I'd probably be saying one of the theorems, so maybe 11 or 12. Again, who knows, but that would just be a small guess for that. Similar triangles tends to kind of come up in some shape or form as a kind of a small bit in our length, area, volume geometry questions. So make sure you know congruent and similar triangles. Congruent actually came up last year. So again, I'd be just making sure you understand similar triangles and how it can help us with those angle questions, with your alternate corresponding vertically opposite angles. Then spheres, cones, cylinders, again, all tend to feature in some capacity on the exam, particularly in our section B questions. So do make sure you've had a quick look over those, and you know the difference between curved surface area and total surface area. And then your circles, your sectors, your arcs as well. Make sure you're happy with that. So guys, hopefully that has been a useful video. As I said, I know there's nothing groundbreaking here, but it's just to kind of point you in the right direction and just get you thinking along the right lines of the types of things that you're going to expect to see on the exam. Wishing you all the best of luck, and let us know how you get on with the papers once you sit them in June, and we'll be keeping an eye out and checking in with you all on our social media then. Thanks, guys.